Here is your tea. Thank you very much.
April 1945. A quiet afternoon sun settles over the rolling fields of the American Midwest. Beyond the barbed wire fence of a U.S. prisoner of war camp, rows of wooden barracks stretch toward the horizon, still and cautious. Inside, a group of young women in faded German uniforms sit in silence, hands resting on their laps, eyes downcast. They have been auxiliaries, phone operators, clerks, nurses, caught in the chaos of the collapsing Reich. They expected hostility, judgment, a cold reminder of the war they had served. Instead, the camp gates open. A line of civilian women from the nearby town walks in, dressed neatly, carrying baskets covered in white cloth. Steam rises from metal urns. The smell of tea and freshly baked bread slips through the air, almost unreal. The German prisoners exchange nervous glances. Their training had taught them to distrust everything from the enemy. Yet the American women smile, not with triumph, but with something disarming, simple kindness. Invited to sit, offer cups, ask their names, where had placed them on opposite sides of history. Now a quiet table stood between them, and nothing felt certain anymore. These encounters did not begin in silence. They began with a question. How did enemies become guests? To understand why German women found themselves drinking tea with the very people they were told to fear, one must return to the final chapters of the Second World War, a moment when the walls of the Third Reich were crumbling and long-held certainties disintegrated with them. By late 1944, Germany had mobilized almost every available resource. The Wehrmacht was bleeding on the Eastern Front, battered in Italy, and driven back across Western Europe after the Allied landings in Normandy. As casualties mounted, the Nazi state turned increasingly to its women, not only as factory workers and agricultural laborers, but as essential auxiliaries in uniform. Nearly 500,000 women served in the German military structure. Many became Helferinnen, signal operators, cryptographers, clerks, medics, and anti-aircraft spotters. Some operated close to the Nazi elite, embedded in the Luftwaffe communications networks, in field hospitals, and even within SS administrative offices. They carried no rifles into the trenches, yet they were part of the machinery that kept the war alive. As Allied forces advanced into Germany from both east and west, thousands of these women were captured in uniform. The Geneva Convention required that they be treated as prisoners of war, an unusual situation that challenged traditional expectations of who the enemy combatant was supposed to be. In the public imagination of the time, the enemy soldier was male, violent, hardened. Women in German uniform did not fit the mold. Yet loyalty to the regime varied wildly among them. Some believed deeply in National Socialism. Others were simply caught in the path history had forced upon them. Many were transported across the Atlantic, far from the ruins of Europe, to camps spread throughout the United States, Texas, Arkansas, Nebraska, Michigan, and dozens more. Here, they were held behind fences but surrounded by landscapes untouched by the devastation of war. Towns went about their daily routine. Children played in the streets. Factories operated without the sound of sirens. The U.S. military ran the camps with oversight from the Red Cross to maintain compliance with the Geneva rules. Prisoners received proper meals, medical assistance, access to mail, and organized work duties. Life could feel astonishingly calm compared to the firestorms that had consumed Hamburg or Dresden. Still, there was isolation, displacement, anxiety about families left behind under Allied bombs or Soviet occupation. But most of all, there was culture shock. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as brutal, uncultured, and racially chaotic, people with no discipline, no honor, no civility. The women had expected guards who hated them, civilians who despised them. Instead, They found themselves approached not with stones or fists, but with curiosity. Local Americans, especially women, looked at these prisoners and saw something different than enemies. They saw other women, often young, often frightened, thrust into a war not of their choosing. They wondered about their stories, their families, their hopes. Church groups, Red Cross volunteers, and civic organizations sought to interact with the POWs, not to punish them, but to encourage cooperation, challenge Nazi ideology, and demonstrate democratic values in a tangible form. It was a strategy rooted both in morality and practicality. Prisoners who felt human were easier to manage. Those who saw dignity across the wire might someday help rebuild peace. This delicate balance between victory and empathy created one of the war's quietest and most surprising encounters. One that unfolded slowly, one conversation and gesture at a time, from the faraway battlefields to a quiet American camp. These women carried the weight of a collapsing regime into a world that appeared almost untouched by war. And soon, they would face the moment that challenged everything they had been told about enemies, about women, about humanity. Inside these American POW camps, daily life followed a rhythm built not around fear, but around structure. Prisoners woke early, performed morning roll call, and then moved into assigned labor: farm work, laundry, kitchen service, or maintenance. They were paid small wages in camp currency, allowing them to purchase necessities or occasional small comforts. Many had never experienced such order without the oppressive scrutiny of Nazi authority. Yet the greatest difference was psychological. There were no Gestapo officers here, no threat of denunciation, no propaganda loudspeakers warning of traitors hiding among them. Instead, they found bulletin boards filled with schedules for English classes, craft workshops, and even lectures on American democracy. Some camps hosted libraries with German-language books. Others screened films, carefully chosen stories about freedom, fairness, and accountability. Red Cross inspectors noted that many facilities exceeded what the Geneva Convention required. To women brought up under rigid indoctrination, these moments felt unreal. The Allied world they were shown did not match the enemy caricature they had been taught to imagine. That dissonance laid the foundation for the most profound transformation. Local civic groups, especially women's auxiliaries, churches, and charity organizations, were permitted to sponsor small outreach activities. These civilians lived just beyond the fence, witnessing the war only through newspaper headlines and service flags, hung in windows for loved ones overseas. Their sons and brothers had fought these prisoners' countrymen in deadly battles, yet hostility did not always follow. Many American women felt a sense of duty to offer compassion where the war had stripped it away. The idea gained support from military psychologists and intelligence officers. Kindness could cut deeper into the ideological fabric of National Socialism than any interrogation. So supervised gatherings were proposed, carefully arranged, strictly controlled. Red Cross volunteers brought books, board games, and sewing materials. Some prisoners were allowed into town under guard to help harvest crops or repair damage caused by storms. Essential contributions during a period of labor shortage in the United States. Those interactions maintained boundaries but offered glimpses of normal life. During these tasks, conversations began. Broken English met hesitant German. Smiles bridged political divides. The barriers of language and uniform softened, even if only for a few minutes at a time. The first tea gatherings emerged from this evolving curiosity. For many American women, hosting tea was a symbol of hospitality, a familiar ritual in a time of unfamiliar war. A warm drink, a moment of calm, a gesture that said, "I see you as a person, not a symbol." For German prisoners, tea with the enemy was unthinkable. Their indoctrination had described Americans as primitive, violent cowards who relied on machines instead of courage. to be spoken to politely, to be asked questions about everyday life in Germany, was a direct confrontation of everything they had believed. Some rejected it internally, clinging tightly to the ideology that had shaped them. Others felt confusion, a crack forming in the wall built by years of controlled information. A simple invitation to tea became a silent battle for hearts and minds. Because if kindness could exist among the enemy, then perhaps everything else they had been told was a lie. As these interactions increased, tensions within the prisoner population grew. Not everyone welcomed the possibility of change. Some feared retribution from loyal Nazis within the camp ranks. The line between hope and suspicion remained fragile. Soon, those fragile interactions would lead directly into the pivotal encounters. The first moments where gratitude and mistrust sat together over shared cups of tea. The psychological collision was immediate. Many of the German women imprisoned in the United States had come from cities reduced to rubble. They had witnessed the relentless devastation of Allied bombings. Families scattered, children crying in cellars, neighborhoods burned to ash. For them, the outside world had become synonymous with chaos and destruction. Yet here, in this quiet country thousands of miles away, life looked untouched. Green fields, friendly voices, houses with lights that stayed on at night, people who smiled without fear of the next air raid. For the prisoners, stepping into a room set for tea, tables lined with lace cloth, plates of pastries, flowers in small vases, felt like a distortion of reality. The war had taught them to brace for hostility. The enemy offering comfort was something their minds could barely process. Some sat stiffly, hands trembling around the fragile porcelain cups. Others stared quietly, analyzing every gesture. Why are they being kind to us? What do they want in return? Is this a trick? The American women asked gentle questions. Do you have brothers at the front? Are you worried for your parents? Did you work in communications or medicine? They listened, not as victors, but as individuals curious about the lives shaped by the same war that had taken their own loved ones. And in rare moments of vulnerability, laughter escaped the tension. One Red Cross volunteer later recounted how a young German woman was astonished to see sugar served without ration coupons. Another expressed disbelief that American mothers could send their sons to college, rather than solely to war. These were glimpses into a world of possibility, one the Nazi regime had never shown them. Still, loyalties battled beneath the surface. A few prisoners refused to speak English despite understanding it. Others declined invitations, fearing what their fellow countrywomen might think. In the camp hierarchy, open friendliness toward the enemy could be viewed as betrayal, punishable through threats or intimidation after the gatherings. Yet as weeks passed, the seats at those tables slowly filled. Suspicion gave way to curiosity, and curiosity led to the most dangerous discovery of all. The enemy did not always look like the monster propaganda had sworn she would be. These tea gatherings did not emerge solely from kindness. They were part of a psychological strategy shaped by the Allied occupation plans. Military officials understood that Germany would not only be defeated on the battlefield. It had to be rebuilt, re-educated, and removed from the grip of Nazism. Brutality could not destroy an ideology rooted in identity. But humanity could challenge the very fear that helped sustain it. Offering respect to prisoners reinforced the principle of a lawful and moral international order, something the Nazi state had rejected. When German women encountered fairness instead of cruelty, they began questioning the regime that had promised them protection but delivered catastrophe. This was not naive idealism. It was strategic influence. Every conversation about family, every newspaper article made available in the camp library, every demonstration of civil debate, and personal liberty served a purpose. Show the prisoners that there was life beyond dictatorship. Church and civic organizations played a significant role. For many volunteers, faith guided their actions. The Christian value of loving one's enemy, difficult in theory, radical in practice, found expression in these gatherings, and the military recognized its utility. Where confrontation hardened resistance, compassion planted uncertainty. Slowly, the German women realized that the Americans did not fear them. That confidence radiated throughout every interaction. In contrast, the Nazi regime had relied heavily on fear. Fear of defeat, fear of dissent, fear of the outsider. In the calm of a prison camp, over something as gentle as tea, that fear began to dissolve. And in its place, a new question grew. If the enemy is capable of kindness, what else might be true about the world outside the Reich? The power of that question would soon test friendships, loyalties, and beliefs in ways the women never expected. That internal struggle leads to a deeper conflict, one that unfolded not between nations, but within each prisoner herself. While German prisoners struggled to interpret kindness from their captors, the actions of American women were shaped by a different war, one fought inside the home. They had endured years of rationing, watched sons and husbands leave for battle, and waited daily for telegrams that could shatter their world. They understood sacrifice. They understood fear. And the sight of young women, far from home and placed behind fences, stirred something deeply human within them. Many volunteers were guided by community and faith organizations. Church groups hosting fellowship gatherings, Red Cross units organizing humanitarian programs, civic clubs arranging educational activities. These women were not naive. They knew the uniforms that sat across from them represented a regime responsible for global suffering. Some arrived at the camps determined to show strength, not tenderness. But sitting face-to-face with prisoners changed the dynamic. Conversations slipped into topics no ideology could erase. Family recipes, childhood memories, music from before the war. A shared humanity emerged almost in defiance of national boundaries. Still, the Americans were keenly aware of their role in a larger strategic effort. They were demonstrating the values the Allies hoped would take root in a post-war Germany. Free expression, I respect for human dignity, the right to disagree without fear. These ideas did not come with lectures or pamphlets, but through actions, warm bread rather than orders, smiles instead of accusations. Influence expressed with grace. To many volunteers, offering hospitality to those who were once enemies was not weakness. It was a declaration of strength, a message that democracy did not rely on hatred to survive. War draws harsh lines, friend or foe, right or wrong, victory or defeat. Yet history is shaped just as much by the blurred spaces between those lines. The treatment of female German POWs in the United States became one of those spaces. Moral expectations collided here. There were Americans who believed prisoners should feel the full weight of the destruction their country had caused. There were German loyalists who viewed any kindness from the enemy as manipulation, an attempt to soften them for ideological conquest. And there were those on both sides who simply wanted to reclaim a sliver of normal life. Providing dignity to prisoners did not erase the crimes of the regime they had served. It did not absolve the horrors unfolding across Europe, but it demonstrated a concept vital to international law and post-war justice. Accountability does not require cruelty. By allowing the women to retain their identity, names instead of numbers, uniforms instead of rags, the U.S. signaled that justice would differentiate between individuals and systems. While some German women held strong ideological convictions, others have been swept into uniform by necessity and coercion. Compassion gave room to recognize those differences. Yet no moral action in war is without tension. Some Americans questioned whether such generosity dishonored their own losses. Others feared the prisoners would return home unchanged, free to carry hate into the next generation. But the hope remained that seeds planted in captivity might bloom in peace. The tea gatherings became a powerful symbol of this hope, a quiet rebellion against the dehumanization that war demands, and a reminder that enemies are often strangers who have simply never been given a chance to understand one another. Those chances grew in number, and soon the camps witnessed moments that neither side could have anticipated, moments where the barriers of belief began to crack in full view. And at the center of this quiet transformation stood a simple ritual, two hands reaching out, offering a cup. It began like any other planned gathering, supervised, structured, cautiously optimistic. But as spring warmed the fields around the camp, the meetings grew less formal, the atmosphere less guarded. What started as an experiment was turning into a real emotional bridge. One documented afternoon stands out in accounts from both volunteers and former prisoners. The camp hall had been rearranged to resemble a small cafe, tables set with modest linens, chairs neatly aligned. An American sergeant checked the perimeter as local women carried in trays of cups and plates. The air smelled of fruit preserves mixed with strong black tea. When the prisoners entered, many hesitated before crossing the threshold. Some paused to straighten their uniforms, suddenly more aware of how they appeared. A few whispered anxiously, wondering what invisible agenda might lie beneath such friendliness. But then, something unexpected happened. A young American woman, no older than many of the prisoners, recognized one of them. The German girl had been assigned to harvest corn on her family's farm weeks earlier. They had shared awkward smiles then, working silently under the sun. Now, in a strange twist of history, they found themselves across a table from each other. The volunteer greeted her by name. The prisoner froze. For years, her identity had been defined only by rank, duty, and obedience. To be acknowledged personally by someone who should hate her was disarming in a way no confrontation on the front lines could ever be. Other conversations slowly formed around the room. An American woman showed photographs of her children. A German prisoner produced a small creased picture of her younger brother in uniform. Another pair discovered they both loved classical piano. Mozart for one, Beethoven for the other. A volunteer asked a former Luftwaffe telephonist what it was like working in underground bunkers during air raids. The prisoner replied quietly that she would rather forget the sound of screaming metal tearing through ceilings above her head. The mood shifted. The enemy became a storyteller. The listener became a witness. The most striking moments came not from the words exchanged, but from what was revealed in silence. Tears suppressed quickly, hands that trembled while reaching for sugar bowls, cautious laughter that sounded like a forgotten language. And slowly, an unspoken truth emerged. They were all victims of the same war. Different uniforms, different fates, but the same longing for normal life. Yet even as this fragile empathy took shape, an invisible divide persisted: loyalty. Some German women remained fiercely ideological. They glared at those who warmed to the Americans. A few refused to take tea at all, standing with stiff backs near the walls, eyes full of warning. The U.S. Guards noticed. They documented internal conflicts rising among the prisoners. Pressure to maintain loyalty to Nazism, enforced through silent intimidation and occasional whispered threats. But on that afternoon, the change could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. One woman, previously cold and distant, finally spoke in hesitant English. She confessed she had expected cruelty, humiliation, perhaps even revenge. Instead, she found dignity. She said she did not know what to make of that. The volunteer sitting across from her simply replied, "Maybe that is the point." Something invisible shifted in that moment. The psychological front line moved, not across nations, but across minds. By the time the women were escorted back to their barracks, they walked differently, not as faceless representatives of a defeated empire, but as individuals who had been seen, heard, and treated as equal for the first time in years. Outside, the American volunteers cleaned the tables in thoughtful silence. They understood that no battle ends cleanly, but they also believed they had contributed to a different kind of victory. Inside the camp, however, this new reality began to stir resistance. Those loyal to the Nazi worldview sensed their influence slipping. And soon, conflict would not come from outside the wire, but from within it. The most profound changes did not erupt in the tea hall. They unfolded quietly in the barracks afterward. Women who returned from these gatherings carried something back with them: doubt. Not loud enough to be spoken openly, but visible in stolen glances, in softened arguments, in the absence of fear when discussing the future. The emotional armor demanded by the Nazi worldview had begun to crack, revealing something dangerously fragile beneath it: independent thought. And that did not go unnoticed. Within many POW camps, German prisoners formed internal hierarchies. The most ideologically driven, the convinced National Socialists, asserted authority through reputation and intimidation. They viewed the Americans' hospitality as a weapon, a subtle assault on loyalty to the fatherland. To them, every smile from across the table was an attempt to conquer their spirit. Whispered warnings spread through the bunks. Don't trust them. They want to turn you against your homeland. Remember who you are. Some nights, arguments erupted. A woman who had dared to compliment an American's kindness might be accused of betrayal. Friendships fractured under the weight of suspicion. But the seeds had already taken root. The women who had sat across from the Americans found themselves replaying their conversations in the quiet darkness. They asked questions that had been forbidden in their former lives. What if victory does not prove righteousness? What if the Reich lied to us? What if the world outside is nothing like what we were told? These thoughts, sharper than any weapon, pierced the ideological certainty that had long held its grip. Intelligence officers soon noticed subtle shifts. Reports described growing divides among the prisoners. Tensions between those clinging fiercely to Nazi doctrine and those who hesitated before repeating propaganda slogans. Acknowledgement of doubt had become a sign of courage and danger. The Americans exploited this carefully, though always within humanitarian boundaries. More invitations followed, more opportunities for discussion. The cups of tea were accompanied by reading materials, German-language newspapers with uncensored war updates, articles about life in democratic societies, photographs of towns rebuilding rather than burning. Reality, verified, printed, undeniable, began replacing myth. For some women, the realization struck with painful clarity. Their families had been misled. Their futures had been gambled by a regime collapsing under its own ambition. The ideological war continued there in the camp, not through bullets, but through ideas. The Americans did not need to force beliefs. They simply revealed what had always been hidden. And bit by bit, the truth spread. The enemy was not the monster. The monster might have been the world that had convinced them otherwise. This internal turning point gained strength as news from Europe became more definitive. Germany was losing irreversibly. The women could no longer shield themselves with propaganda. They knew loved ones were either displaced, starving, or dead. The Reich had not protected them. It had abandoned them. In the tea hall, some broke down in tears upon hearing that Allied troops had liberated concentration camps, truths their regime had denied. Volunteers offered tissues, hands placed gently upon shaking shoulders. No celebration, only sorrow, because in that moment, the greatest conflict was not between two nations. It was between truth and the remnants of belief. When the next invitations came, more women accepted without hesitation. They no longer attended as weary prisoners. They came as people searching for a future. The transformation that began with cautious sips of tea now radiated through the barracks, altering behavior, tone, posture, even hope itself. War had brought them there. Humanity was showing them a way beyond it. What they would do with that discovery, how they would carry it home when released, would shape the next chapter of their lives, and perhaps even the future of their country. But the war was not yet over, and the consequences of this transformation were just beginning. As the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, the world shifted overnight for the women behind the wire. No longer soldiers of a warring nation, they became representatives of a defeated one. The war was over, the flags changed, and they were left to reconcile two conflicting realities. The empire they had served was gone. The enemy that had captured them had shown unexpected humanity. Repatriation did not come immediately. Months passed as the U.S. and Allied command processed millions of prisoners spread across multiple continents. For the German women, uncertainty replaced ideology as the dominant force shaping their lives. In the meantime, several continued attending educational programs organized by American officers and volunteers. Workshops taught them practical skills, English language, typing, nursing techniques that could help rebuild their lives in a broken homeland. Discussions about freedom and responsibility continued, now focused on reconstruction rather than conflict. Some of the women wrote letters home, though replies were slow and often devastating. Families described cities without roofs, streets without food, hope replaced by mourning. They learned that their prior beliefs held no power against hunger, displacement, or the fear of Soviet occupation. In this state of emotional vulnerability, memories of American kindness became anchors. One former prisoner later remarked in testimony that she had expected punishment for the defeats Germany had inflicted. Instead, she experienced a form of mercy she struggled to explain. It was not forgiveness. Too many wounds remained open, but it was a refusal to replicate cruelty. Many prisoners carried vivid images of the tea gatherings, simple conversations that had dismantled years of indoctrination. They would remember how the American women listened, how guards treated them fairly, how newspapers told truths they had never been allowed to read. They would remember that no one called them monsters. Not all left the camps transformed. Some remained angry. Some insisted the Americans had used manipulation to weaken their loyalty. But even those who clung to bitterness could not deny what they had seen, justice delivered without humiliation. By late 1946 and through 1947, the women were gradually transported back to Germany. The journey home was sobering. Ships crossed the Atlantic carrying not triumphant soldiers, but a generation of young women forced to face the consequences of a government that had promised them glory and delivered ruin. Upon arrival, they found rubble where cities once stood. They faced suspicion from neighbors, interrogation from denazification boards, and a society struggling to define itself without the ideology that had dominated their youth. For some, the quiet lessons from the POW camps became guiding principles. For others, those memories remained locked away, overshadowed by the urgency of survival. And yet, across scattered towns, stories emerged, whispered first, then spoken louder, of Americans who treated them with dignity. These accounts did not erase the horrors of the war, but they complicated the narrative of enemy and victor. The tea gatherings had become part of a living testimony. Even in war's aftermath, humanity could be a catalyst for rebuilding what hatred had destroyed. That rebuilding and the personal conflicts that followed form the next stage of the story. Germany in 1947 was not a place of homecoming. It was a test of survival. Cities that once stood as symbols of European culture were now jagged landscapes of stone and twisted steel. Food was rationed to the gram. Families crowded into underground cellars and the shells of buildings with missing walls. Millions were displaced, wandering roads and rail lines in search of anything familiar. Into this world returned the German women who had spent the final years of the conflict as prisoners of war. They were no longer guided by propaganda, uniforms, or commands shouted in parade grounds. They returned as individuals, some hopeful, others ashamed, many deeply conflicted. Their neighbors and relatives listened to their experiences with caution. Some did not believe their stories of how the enemy had treated them. Some refused to believe that American guards could have shown kindness when German newsreels for years had dehumanized the Allies as monsters. And others asked questions the former prisoners struggled to answer. Did you know what was happening in the East? Did you believe in the Fuhrer? How could we let our country fall so far? The women realized they were not only rebuilding physical homes, they were rebuilding their own identities. The labels they once carried, telephonists, clerks, nurses, auxiliaries, were replaced with a single one, defeated. Yet, quietly, the seeds of transformation planted in U.S. camps began to bloom. Some women who learned English in captivity found work as interpreters for the new Allied administrations. Others used nursing and administrative skills to join hospitals and reconstruction offices, often becoming essential links between German civilians and the occupying authorities. They understood America not as an abstract enemy, but as real people, people who had given them books, answered their questions, and shared honest debates over cups of tea. Those simple acts followed them into post-war life. One recalled that for the first time, she questioned what she had once obeyed without thought. She had been raised to believe national glory required sacrifice, other sacrifice. But the war had shown her the cost. Countless lives, including her own youth, spent in service to illusions. She wrote in her diary that she wanted her children, if she was ever lucky enough to have them, to grow up without fear of speaking freely. Another former prisoner volunteered with youth groups to teach young girls values of cooperation rather than indoctrination. She never publicly mentioned where her awakening began, but in private she admitted, "It started when they poured me tea and asked me what I thought about the world." Of course, not every former POW embraced change. Some clung to bitterness, convinced that Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated. The scars of war did not disappear with peace. Healing took years, sometimes lifetimes, and for some, healing never came at all. But for many, those months behind American barbed wire had opened a door. A few women even married former Allied soldiers. Rare, controversial unions at the time. Those relationships symbolized the most personal form of reconciliation. Love emerging from a conflict that had sworn enemies could never share the same humanity. The transformation was not loud. It was not celebrated in newspapers or commemorated with medals. It happened quietly, in homes rebuilt stone by stone, in families relearning trust, and in personal choices shaped by lessons learned in captivity. The true impact of those POW years would unfold not in 1947, but across decades in the values passed to children who never knew the war. Children who grew up in a Germany that rejected dictatorship, embraced democracy, and became one of Europe's strongest advocates for peace. The American policy that guided the women's treatment in the camps, education instead of humiliation, debate instead of indoctrination, proved something extraordinary. Sometimes the most powerful victory is not won on the battlefield, but in the hearts of those once taught to hate you. History often remembers war by its loudest moments: battles, invasions, the roar of artillery, and the collapse of empires. Yet, the quietest moments can carry consequences just as lasting. In a U.S. prisoner of war camped thousands of miles from Berlin, a pot of tea and a place at a table challenged years of hatred more effectively than any weapon ever could. For the German women who had lived through the fear, indoctrination, and pressure of a collapsing regime, kindness from an enemy was not just surprising. It was transformative. It confronted the narrative they had been taught, that the United States was a brutal adversary determined to erase them. Instead, they found neighbors offering compassion without expectation. No politics, no ceremony, just humanity. And this mattered because wars do not end when firing stops. They end when people choose what comes next: resentment or rebuilding, punishment or peace. In these encounters, ordinary American women became unintentional diplomats. Their actions whispered a message the world desperately needed in the shadow of 1945. If conflict can be taught, so can forgiveness. Many of those prisoners returned to a Germany struggling to define its future. Some carried with them small gestures of goodwill that helped soften the return from fanaticism to reality. Some remember the tea parties as the first time they felt hope again. Others never spoke of it aloud, yet the memory lived quietly inside, proof that compassion can interrupt the cycle of violence. There was no headline, no medal awarded. These meetings lasted only hours, maybe days. But they stripped away the anonymity of war and reminded everyone involved that an enemy is only a stranger whose story you do not yet know. When we look back on the Second World War, this chapter may seem small beside the enormity of destruction. But sometimes history changes not in the halls of power or on the battlefield, but across a simple table where two sides sit down, share bread, and choose to see each other as human again.